Hi everyone, and welcome back to Coachy TV. This video we're going to take a look back at that fictitious macrocycle that we've been dealing with, looking at the specific prep phase, and we're going to fill in the blanks that we've sort of left there over looking through the workouts we've added in specific prep. If you looked at our series where we looked at general prep, every time we introduced a workout, we went into this fictitious macrocycle and we filled in the blanks. And then when we went to specific prep, we added some new workout types, and every time we had a video on that, we also went and put it into the fictitious macrocycle. But as we know, things that were important in general prep are still important in specific prep. So I didn't want to go through and do a whole video that said, well, here's, this workout type in specific prep, when really it's the same thing. So I just wanted to kind of have one that kind of consolidated all of those things in once, looking at a calendar, both looking at what you could do in those situations, and what I kind of chose to do is I was filling out this fictitious macrocycle. So what we're doing here is we're completing the phase of this workout plan for specific prep. And basically what we're going to be considering is what workouts are needed for a complete specific prep phase, thinking about the event itself and the phase that we're in, what we're trying to accomplish, and what kind of volume and volume ratio are needed for the specific prep phase as we're looking at these things a little bit more closely. Picture you're seeing here, this is members of the 2020 Wharton Boys and Girls Track Team. It was the distance and the middle distance group. At the end of our year, we did a little end of the award ceremony, even though the fact of the matter is the season didn't end, the way it normally would at a state meet or whatever. We still wanted to, sort of share in our successes of the season. And this is a picture from that ceremony that we had. I am Kyle Giacono, the head boys cross country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 7 years. If you'd like a closer look at some of my credentials, they are on the screen. So, macrocycle has 5 parts. We've talked about this previously. The first of those parts includes no training. It's the transitionary phase in between seasons, that is rest and recovery. And then the next 4 phases deal with actual workout types and different goals that you're trying to work with. General prep, which most of the world is still currently in, even though it's the second half of it, is general preparation phase. That's your summer for cross country. It's your winter for track. And basically what you're doing there is you're just preparing for more intense work later on. And that's why we did a specific type of workouts. We were just getting prepared to do something more intense later on. Here in specific prep, we're really focusing on specifically preparing for the demands of the race, and that's all demands of the race. We're in general prep, we're only looking at a specific type of aspects that we're dealing with in terms of the race. Specific prep gets us ready for the pre-competitive phase, which is preparing for the most important meets, and it also comes with, in pre-competitive phase, the hardest of the workouts of the season. I talked about this in detail in a video we did on long hill intervals. It'll be in the description down below. I would recommend taking a look at that. But basically, the idea being is this is the time frame that directly leads into the competitive meets, your state meets and your qualifiers for it. So those are where the things do have to be the most challenging workouts to be ready. And then we get to the competition phase, and it's the big time meets. It's where the races really are dictating what you're doing, where up here, it's the workouts that are dictating what you're doing to get ready for this last part of the season. So if we're here in specific prep and we're trying to get ready for all the specific demands of the race, we better know what makes up the race itself. So the metrics of the 5K, this study that was published in 2008, principal author Ingham, just a fantastic study that looked at a bunch of different races. They were trying to figure out what was the principal reason why somebody won the race or did not win the race, and looked at a bunch of different things and a bunch of different races. And in the 5K, it was very clear that whoever had the best VO2 max won 94.3% of the time. Single indicator, meaning it's a very strong indicator. It's a very strong part of the race, and we better spend a lot of time looking at VO2 max, because 94.3% of the time, if you have the better VO2 max, you are going to win the race. And just sort of anecdotally, if you've been somebody that's done things like your VO2 max tests and things like that, typically speaking, the people that come in first in your VO2 max test are also going to be the ones that are best in your 5K. It just sort of stands to reason that if you can run faster aerobically, and that's what VO2 max is, it's the pace at which your body reaches a volume V of oxygen at its maximum capacity, meaning you're using the most oxygen possible. It just stands to reason if you're running the fastest aerobically, you're going to do well in this race. There's other things that can factor in, especially at the end of the race, or poor race strategy or better race strategy. But that's why this is such a good indicator. And kind of building on that, from the USATF distance coaching curriculum, we will find that the 5K is run at 97% of your VO2 max, or really this should be considered almost your 2-mile pace because that's one of the best field tests for it. So that close association, you're running just a little bit slower in the 5K than you would at VO2 max or 2-mile pace. That's why there's probably another reason for that very close association. And this study that was published by Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018, they worked very closely with the IAAF when they looked at the 5K, because they looked at a bunch of different races, and they were looking at sort of a snapshot, several, over, basically any point in time in the races where the energy was coming from, and that was why this study, I think, is just groundbreaking when it comes to all these different races. It didn't just look at calories burnt, it didn't just look at acid levels, it didn't look at all these things that studies in the past had looked at. It really looked at sort of a snapshot, second by second, where is the energy coming from in the athlete that's doing the race. And when they looked at the 5K, they found that 4% of the energy came from the ATP that was sitting in their muscles, and then the phosphocreatine, and that's collectively called the alactic system. Basically, in my mind, I consider this kind of specific strength because you train this with things like fly 30s and a little bit with things like hill runs. So to me, this is sort of a specific strength kind of thing. When we looked at the anaerobic glycolytic system, which is 10% of the energy at race pace in the 5K, so that is important. It is at race pace. If you walk a 5K, it'll be like 99% aerobic because the other two systems are on. They're just not going to be working as hard. The anaerobic glycolytic system supplies 10% of the energy, which is a sizable chunk. You definitely don't want to throw that away. And that comes from acid buffering capacity. This is the acid, trained with acid-producing workouts like your extensive tempo, intensive tempo, special 1 and special 2, videos in the description down below on each of those. But those are important also for this 10% of the energy supply at race pace in the 5K. And then no surprise here, the aerobic system is making the lion's share of the energy, 86% of it. This is why in general prep you're doing a lot of this. This is basically your, directly related to the VO2 max. There's different things, central VO2 max, peripheral VO2 max, all those things make up the overall VO2 max, but the aerobic system is what is charging VO2 max. The anaerobic glycolytic system, no bearing on VO2 max. Same thing with the ATP and phosphocreatine system. When we look a little bit later on, we'll find that there's one other component that we're training in this phase, which is called running economy, and it kind of makes up all of these three things collectively together that we'll talk about when we get there. This very important thing to consider, the law of training specificity, which says that every training session has a specific training effect on the athlete. Seems simple enough. You do workout A, the athlete is going to get training effect A. You do workout B, training effect B is going to happen. But just because something's simple doesn't mean it's something that can just be ignored, because you have to then consider, if you want training effect B, you better do workout B, and you better be sure that workout B is getting that training effect, right? Because the second part of the law of training specificity is really critical, which every training session has a specific effect on the athlete, which may or may not be desired for the event. So you better know what you're trying to train and why you're doing it, how you're doing it, all those different things. You better sort of know that, because if you're trying to get workout effect A, but the workout you're doing is really, say, workout, I don't know, C or something like that, you're not going to be getting what you want. You may think you are, you may want it to be that way, but you better know how people adapt, and things like that, to also have it make sense, and basically know the demands of the race also, because just because you're training does not mean you're making yourself better. If you're training something that makes all of these ratios that we see on the screen here out of whack, you could be hurting yourself or who you're training, especially the more trained somebody is. The first year that somebody's trained, basically any training is going to make them better because they're just getting better at running. But as somebody gets older, second, third, fourth year running, and especially somebody who's been running for a long time, you better know this law of training specificity, you better know the race metrics, and you better also know the part of the year that you're in and how you're going to develop these different aspects. So that's really what we're looking at here, is what workouts, volume, and ratio will create the best adaptation for success in the cross-country 5K. And I probably should have added in specific prep, because that's what we're working with here. All those things, all these things individually seem simple, but you have to kind of see how they all play together in sort of like a big circle, as well as also knowing who the athlete is and what they need. So all these different little things are adding up to a much bigger complex picture here when we're trying to complete this phase of the training year. Alright, so just to briefly look at where does the 5K kind of fit in when you kind of play it out with all these different workouts we're going to be doing in the different races. This is the source from the USA TF Distance curriculum that I referenced a little bit before. The 5K is right there, which again, as we said, is run at 97% of your VO2 max. As you can see, VO2 max is basically 2-mile pace. We've got 3K, which is going to be run obviously a little bit faster. You've got your mile, your half mile all the way out here. If this was a sprint coach's curriculum, the 400 would be right here at Special Endurance 1. The 800 is typically close to Special Endurance 2. Things like intensive tempo and extensive tempo, I have videos on them in the description down below, as well as anaerobic alactic. I focused on it in general prep, but it's the same thing here in specific prep. And also your aerobic workouts, your lactic threshold, which is at, really it's more like 85%, but in some people it can be all the way up to 90% depending on how well trained they are. This is close to critical velocity, which is also 10K pace, which I do not really recommend for the vast majority of people. I have a video in the description down below on tempo running in general prep that might be interesting if you have somebody that's very, very highly skilled athlete who's been running for a while and you need to push another metric. This is something that you could also add some benefit for. Most high school kids and people that are in their first couple years running, this is not a workout type that's going to help them all that much, as well as things like marathon pace, which is all the way up here. Your long and recovery runs are at aerobic threshold, which is down here. Just wanted to show you where this all kind of fits in on a energy continuum. So the aspects of specific prep cross-country training, we talked about this a little bit already. One of the big ones here is central VO2 max improvement, and I'll put both of these on the screen as well as peripheral VO2 max. Those collectively make up that VO2 max we talked about as the 94.3% winning predictor in the 5K. I think that central VO2 max comes first because this really has to be trained first before you can get to peripheral for a couple reasons. But central VO2 max, general aerobic work done for at least 20 continuous minutes. I say at aerobic threshold here. Any continuous running or near continuous running can help develop this as long as it's over 20 minutes. So if you're doing intervals and you're jogging in between, that can be continuous or near continuous to where your heart rate isn't dropping below 120. Videos in the description down below on recovery runs and long runs and how to do that. And it generally improves as the body increases the ability to move oxygen from the heart outward. So that's the first bottleneck, right? If we're going to improve VO2 max, oxygen use in the body, we got to get oxygen from the heart outward, right? So that's the first step. And then the second step is peripheral VO2 max, which is trained with aerobic power work only or almost only. This is the best way to train it, which is at 98 to 101% current VO2 max. We're basically right at your 2-mile pace. Video in the description down below on testing this, as well as on interval workouts to execute this. And so central VO2 max is moving the oxygen outward. Peripheral VO2 max generally improves as the body increases the ability of the working muscles to extract the oxygen from the blood for use in the mitochondria. So these collectively improve your VO2 max. This allows your body to carry more oxygen throughout the body. This allows your body to use more of that oxygen that's being moved throughout the body in the working muscles. In this case, we're really dealing with, obviously, mostly in your legs and some other things that help support it and that kind of thing. So this is the big thing. This is the 94.3% winning predictor. These are the two basic aspects of specific prep training that you need to focus on to get VO2 max stronger. We also have this idea of running economy. We talked about this a little bit, and it's sort of more of a, I don't want to say it's a catch-all term, but it takes a lot of different things into account, as well as, you know, the things we just talked about and the other aspects we're going to discuss later. But any general aerobic work can improve running economy, okay? But it's best done at lactic threshold or 85% current VO2 max. And the little asterisk down here says that it varies with athletes in training. Somebody who's less trained, they're going to be at this point at a much lower intensity because they haven't developed their aerobic system yet. Somebody who's very well trained can push this closer to, as I said, possibly 90% or something like that, depending on where they are. But this is, for a trained person, it's where most people fall in. And this generally improves as the body uses the least amount of energy to move. Okay, just like, you know, fuel economy in your car. Includes several aspects such as fuel stores, which is one of the great things that lactic threshold trains. You store more of the fuel at the working muscles, but it's also muscle elasticity, which lactic threshold doesn't really train that. You want to do something that is a little bit higher intensity, more of a strength type run, which we're going to deal with here. And the fourth aspect, specific strength, which we want to target here in specific prep cross-country training, and that can be trained with things like hill runs, typically short intervals, but it can also be through medium hill intervals, which is also something we're doing here in specific prep. And it also is going to be long hill intervals that I have a video in the description down below also that can help with that too. And this does directly improve muscle elasticity and force production, right? Muscle elasticity is this idea that well-trained muscles in specific ways are more elastic, meaning they give more energy when you hit the ground. So this is sort of the idea, if anybody has kind of seen the Vaporflies, and I forget the brand new ones that came out, and those were shoes that were actually banned for a short period, because essentially what they did is they give you muscle elasticity in the shoe. They spring back a little bit. Those shoes are now allowed in almost all races, and the idea being is it's sort of artificially creating muscle elasticity, and you can get 10 to 30% of the energy in your race for free if your muscles are more elastic, and those types of shoes can actually enhance that also. But also hill runs help with force production. Basically, when you have to fire your muscles all at the same time, can you? Kind of that whole idea of sometimes you have a couple people who are right at the end of a 5K, and a couple of them kick away from the other ones, and the other ones don't have that next gear. Things like force production do that with specific strength, as well as in alactic runs, typically as flies, improve muscle coordination and synchronization. So as you're giving force production, you're producing force, your muscles are working together and firing together in a very unified and very efficient way. So kind of tying these things together, running economy, these things can also help improve it, but also with fuel stores with lactic threshold, specific strength, also adding the muscle elasticity. These are sort of their own thing, and they're critically important, and these aspects kind of feed into other aspects. You're not going to really train with specific strength much. You're going to train some central VO2 max, definitely not peripheral, but the idea being is you definitely have to take care of these aspects. These aspects are also important as you're looking at it. But these are the things that we also talked about are just as important in general prep. So what adds to the picture in specific prep are these acid buffering capacity type workouts. And I put this at the very end and also to kind of show you that things kind of get a little crowded when you get into specific prep. I have a video in the description down below talking about using 9-day cycles for this very reason. Acid buffering capacity, which is the anaerobic glycolytic work done faster than VO2 max. We talked about this is the 10% of the energy. We're only starting to work on this in specific prep because of the timing of how the system peaks. I'm not going to go into it here. Video in the description down below about specific prep and some of those workouts we talked about if you want more detail on that. But suffice to say, it peaks differently than specific strength and aerobic system does. So we definitely want to be working on this at the right time. This generally improves as the body stores agents that neutralize acid. That's all we're doing with acid buffering capacity workouts. Keeping the pH near 7.0, and if you remember from your sophomore chemistry class, this is neutral. This is what water is supposed to be if it's sort of pure water, to reduce or delay fatigue. The idea being is if we have some of this in our body and a robust VO2 max aerobic system, and we've got specific strength, and we have this, we can get through all of the race, or most of the race, we can kick hard at the end, and we can delay the fatigue that comes from acidosis, or too much acid developing in your body. So these type of workouts, these acid buffering type workouts, help to reduce and or delay fatigue until after you've crossed the finish line is the idea, because you don't want to, be at that point midway through the race. We want it to be where you're spent after you've crossed the finish line. And just to sort of quickly talk about this, these are the workouts in the specific prep phase that you would be recommended to be doing. These two that are on the screen we talked about also in general prep. The critical ones are the long run, the VO2 max run, as well as the testing and the recovery run. These workouts are critically important to success in developing the key factors needed for success in the cross-country 5K. They focus on improving VO2 max, both central and peripheral. Okay, these ones are critical because they take care of that 94.3%. The important workouts, the first two are specific strength. This one here is your running economy. They're important. These workouts are still very important to cross-country 5K success, but they're less so than these critical workouts. They focus mainly on things like running economy and specific strength. As we said, these help accent what you can do here, but these are the critical. These help accent, they add to it. They can separate people that are somewhat close here if you have a better capacity for specific strength as well as running economy. And the quite important ones, these are the ones that start to happen in specific prep because, again, the timing of the anaerobic glycolytic system. These are the acid buffering capacity workouts. We've got special endurance 1 and 2, intensive tempo and extensive tempo. These workouts cause improvements in the anaerobic glycolytic system, exposing the body to acid. They focus on creating adaptations to buffer this acid, reducing or delaying fatigue. We've already talked about it, but these are the workouts that we're going to deal with as we fill in this phase when we go to the calendar. So again, this idea of multi-tiered training pace for plan for specific prep. More things need to get done during specific prep. We still need to work on the aerobic system and the anaerobic alactic, that alactic system. But the addition of the anaerobic glycolytic work requires longer microcycles. As I said, I have a whole video on this. But my suggestion, which is clearly not novel, this has been passed around for a while, is to use 9 days for this, a 9-day cycle before you start repeating the workouts. Aerobic workouts needed for specific prep, the ones that take 48 hours to recover, are VO2 max runs and tempo runs. 24-hour recoveries are the long runs and the recovery runs. For specific strength, the alactic workouts needed for specific prep, we've got these 24-hour ones, which are medium hill runs and alactic runs. Medium hills sometimes bump up against needing a little bit more recovery, but still, I think you can consider them 24-hour recoveries, but I wouldn't really do them the day before a meet. So they're kind of like a 24-hour plus recovery if you want to think of it like that. And then 48-hour recoveries, at least, are the long hill runs. Video in the description down below. These are the hardest workouts you'll do each year. I even will make sure I'll do these on an off, no racing Saturday or on a Monday to make sure that they're fully recovered by the time you get to a meet, which are typically on Saturday where we are. And then we've got the anaerobic glycolytic workouts needed for specific prep. 48-hour recoveries, these are intensive tempo, special 1, special 2. Extensive tempo, you can actually do those the day before a meet if you need to. Those are pretty easy, they're pretty moderate, and video in the description down below to look at those. But the first one's definitely you want 48 hours, intensive, special 1, special 2. So basically when you're planning out your cycles, your microcycles, your overall phase for this, every time you see a 48-hour recovery workout, you need to follow them with a 24-hour recovery, right? So if you do something from here, a VO2 max run, you need to do a long run after, or you could do an alactic run, or you could do potentially extensive tempo. As I said, it's sort of 48-hour and maybe not. I've certainly done extensive tempos afterwards. Tempo runs are kind of like extensive tempo. I definitely think they're harder than extensive tempo, but you can also do a VO2 max run and come back with a tempo run. In fact, I suggest doing that sometimes if you have unimportant meets. You do the workout the day before, you come back with a tempo run in the meet. It makes for a short tempo run itself, but you can also do that if you needed to. The tempo run, extensive tempo run, you can sometimes backdoor with something, but you definitely then the day after you do that need to come with a true 24-hour recovery. Long run, recovery run, one of these hill runs, alactic runs, that kind of thing. And definitely with something like a long run, you definitely want to go 24-hour recovery the day after that. These are extremely challenging workouts. So this becomes the challenge when you've got 9 days and you've got all these things going on, right? So races also starting here in specific prep too, and those need to be accounted for. Work all 3 energy systems, these races do, but I would most consider them VO2 max. Technically, it's a little bit too slow to be considered a VO2 max aerobic power day, but it's the closest thing to it. I've talked about that with long hill runs, can also be considered a VO2 max kind of run, sort of too. But races definitely need 48-hour recovery. You can go and do a long run, recovery run the next day, which I think would be the best thing to do. I really wouldn't want to do the day after a meet. Anything besides a long run or a recovery run, especially because most of the days are on Sundays, and if someone were to run, it would be on their own. No high school association that I know of allows actual training of an athlete on a Sunday, so it's the only thing that anybody could actually do on their own for the most part anyways. So as you can see, this gets very complicated. We have those 5 key things we have to train with all of these workouts. We've got 9 days to make sure we get everything in so we can get all those important aspects in. I would definitely make sure you're thinking about the aerobic ones first. We talked about these being quite important because you did not work on these in general prep. So you kind of have to come up with a hierarchy, and sometimes it becomes difficult to get them in, especially when you're adhering to this 48-hour, 24-hour rule that we have on the screen here. All right, so now we know what we need to do and the workouts that can actually help us get those adaptations that we want. Let's talk a little bit about the mileage ratio for specific prep, and this is not all that different from general prep, what you would want to target. And I had a video, actually 2 videos on mileage and general prep, but now we have some new workouts that can kind of throw things off, so you want to be specific and careful about how you're planning these things out, because it might become, you might want to go gung-ho with the anaerobic glycolytic workouts and start screwing up the ratios with these other things that are actually more important with the aerobic system. So everything's sort of in balance. So what's a good ratio guide? So So the basic idea, as I said, from general prep still applies essentially. And basically in the book, Daniel's Running Formula, a fantastic book. I would definitely recommend reading it. Dr. Jack Daniels, one of the preeminent distance coaches in the world, he advocates for the following. He says, doing a tempo run, which is basically lactic threshold, workouts should not make up more than 10% of the miles per week. And he's talking about that in terms of each individual workout itself. He's not saying necessarily miles per week, but when you kind of look at it, you're probably not going to be doing more than 2 of these workouts a week, at least with tempo runs, simply because of the nature of lactic threshold running is not super critical for performance in the cross-country 5K. Intervals, which are definitely associated with VO2 max aerobic power, he calls them interval workouts, should not make up more than 8% of the miles per week. And again, because these are so hard, challenging type workouts, you probably would not do more than 1 per week also. Or you would probably not do more than, might do a workout and a race. As we said, a race can sort of be associated with this type of work. And then repetitions, anaerobic glycolytic workouts should not make up more than 5% of the miles per week. And when we lump this into, he doesn't really specify anything from hills or fly 30s, but I've always sort of pushed those into that same category because while they're not working necessarily the anaerobic glycolytic system, they are an important aspect, and they certainly do not fit into any of these other categories. And they're not a ton of the volume, but I would say they're closer associated here than they are up here with anything else. So these you would potentially have more than more than 1 per week. You might have 3 per week if you've got special 1, special 2, and one of these strength runs in here too. So this is where you have to be careful because this is a pretty low amount. But again, these are high intensity type workouts, so that part of the actual miles per week may not make a ton up. But that's where you can sometimes get into trouble if you start doing that. So microcycles are 9 days, but the basics of the week ratio should still basically apply, as I was saying. This is the framework I use when setting up ideal mileage and specific prep. Repetitions, anaerobic glycolytic work are starting. So as we talked about that, and as I mentioned, I lump the strength runs into this category as they're serving to also get us not too far away from speed without accumulating the acids. So they do some of those things. That's why I've kind of lumped them together, even though they're not directly addressed by Dr. Jack Daniels. So my guide for mileage ratio is this right here. Essentially aerobic threshold, and I say ancillary miles because that includes things like active recovery in between reps, because those are basically working aerobic threshold. This is also your warm-up and your cool-downs should be about 75 to 85%. I typically don't get much lower than like 77%. I do like my continuous long and recovery runs and that kind of thing. That's something that I think is really important for this type of thing. But I've gotten as low as that. I'm typically more in the low 80s when I end up doing these for the most part. Lactic threshold, I typically try to target 8 to 10%. But then again, it's the least important thing to do in this phase. So we'll see how that kind of plays out as we start looking at some of these cycles. VO2 max aerobic power, 5 to 8%. And then strength, anaerobic glycolytic runs altogether 1 to 5%. So that's what I use for myself. You take the information I've given you previously, not only in this presentation but other presentations, take what it is, Dr. Jack Daniels' idea on this, read the book, figure out what works for you. This is my guide for mileage ratio. This is not the only guide. This is what works for me and my current situation. Your numbers might be a little bit different depending on your group, or if you're training yourself, and what you have to work with, and what important things you think play a part. So an example of a specific prep microcycle right here. I did a video on how to plan out a 9-day microcycle where I said I have a calendar out and a blank piece of paper where I'm doing something like this, writing it out. It'll be in the video description down below. I would maybe recommend taking a look at that. I just want to show you one example of this, show you the ratio, and then we'll go to the calendar and we'll fill in those spots that we haven't done so yet. But the week is going to break right there. So there's going to be a meet on that 7th day, would have been a Saturday. So we've got recovery run 45 minutes for our top boys. That's going to be a 6-mile day. We've got extensive tempo 5 to 6 400s, which is going to be about 1.5 miles on grass, 3-mile cool down. Long run of 80 to 85 minutes, 11 miles, which is going to end up being 20% of the weekly miles, and I'll show you how I know that in a second. The alactic fly 30s times 10. We're going to do that's about a half mile. That's actually more like 600 meters, but it's the closest thing I could kind of round it to and have it make sense. And a 4-mile cool down. Recovery run, 45 minutes. Oh, and these color-coordinated things are based on that little thing that I showed you before. For the most part, obviously we've got more things going on here, but that's where that all sort of plays into account. Recovery run, 45 minutes, another 6 miles at aerobic threshold. VO2 max intervals, 4 times 1,600 meters. That's 4 miles of aerobic power in blue there, and a 3-mile cool down. And then we've got a meet day here. I said I would do this where I would do a tempo run the day after, but when I do it, I definitely do it with a meet being the next day. I don't like going into it and saying, we're going to tempo a meet and then, have done an easy run the day before. I take their legs away by doing something that's critically important the day before, and now they're forced to tempo run it, essentially. Although a 3-mile tempo is definitely kind of a short tempo run. They're in yellow with the lactic threshold and a 3-mile cool down. Off day the day after, which would be a Sunday, and then intensive tempo special endurance 1. I just had it in this random extra color. When I'm doing it, I usually highlight it in orange, actually, but I didn't have that in this program. 35 seconds on the track, spiked up, 3-mile cool down, another 3 miles. This total cycle, okay, this 9 days is going to have 61 miles. Now, we are missing a hill run, which is an important workout that we wanted to do, but we are, I talk about this in the hill videos, we're on a 2-week off period from hills. I talk about periodizing hills, doing them for 4 to 5 weeks, going away for 2 weeks, and then coming back for other blocks of them. So that's okay to be missing that. Everything else is definitely accounted for in this 9-day cycle. Extensive tempo is going to be at special endurance 2 distance, but certainly not intensity. So the mileage ratio here, the total miles for that cycle is 61 days. The total miles for this first week is 55. So I've talked about in the long run video that you want your long run to be 20 to 22% of the weekly miles. So of 55, 11 of 55 is going to be 20% of it. I guess you could go a little bit longer if you wanted to, but I'm perfectly content with that. If we look at all of these things in the first week only, so everything from above the line, we would see that strength runs and anaerobic glycolytic runs will make up 2 miles. So we've got this 1.5 and this 2. We divide 2 by 55. We get 3.6. That's in that ratio of 1 to 5% I set up previously. Actually, let's do this in reverse order. Aerobic threshold, so all the extra miles, essentially, all these green miles here, the recovery, warm-up, and cool-down, is going to also be 46 of the miles, which is going to be 83.6%. You divide 46 by 55, 83.6%. We're good based on my mileage ratio. As I said, I don't really want to go over 85 miles. That becomes too much low-intensity stuff. But I certainly wouldn't want to be less than 75% either. So 46 miles for this week is going to be spot on. Now, we've got 3 miles at lactic threshold because of that meet. 3 divided by 55 is only 5.5. We said maybe 8 to 10% was sort of ideal, so we are... that was interesting. We are not hitting the mark when it comes to lactic threshold on this, but it's not really that big of a deal. As we said, this is probably the least important of all of these things to deal with in terms of success in the cross-country 5K, so if I'm a little bit off on this, it's okay. I mean, I guess you could have your kids, if they're tempoing a meet, keep going. They're kind of going to look interesting if they do that, but you certainly could to maybe get to 4 miles of tempo running in on here, and then it might be a little bit closer. If you were to divide 4 by 55, you would end up getting 7%. It would still be a little bit on the low end, but again, the least important pace for success in the cross-country 5K, so I'm okay with that. Aerobic power, we've got 4 miles, those 4 times 1,600 meters. That ends up being 4 divided by 55 is 7.2%. It's on the high end, which is perfect because we are specifically preparing for the demands of the race. That's kind of spot on. That is really where you would want to be with this, especially at this time of year. And then, as I said, we already talked about this, the strength run, anaerobic glycolytic runs. Even though we've got 2 of these workouts, we're still in the safe range with 3.6% here. If you were to have 2.5 miles, if we were to have the special endurance workout somehow move up into this, you would have to kind of change things a little bit and divide it by 55. You would still be okay. You'd be at 4.5%, but it would definitely be on the high end for the first week of specific prep, but it would still be okay. I think this is pretty good. I'm pretty happy. Like, if this were to be a workout week that I would do in a 9-day cycle, I would be very happy with this. We've got everything in here that we need. We're a little bit light on tempo, but we've also been doing these all through the summer, so we're okay with that. We were doing 4 and 5 mile tempos. I'm happy with this. We've got everything that we need. We're on a 2-week break from hills. Everything is for the most part in the right ratio. This is a little bit off. 61 miles for the 9 days with an off day is good. You know, usually with an off day, it's low 60s. Without an off day, it's usually high 60s or maybe 70s, depending. And if you just look at the 1 week, it's 55 miles. That's pretty much good. When we think about what's most important for a cross-country season, the two aspects that directly target VO2 max, right? So that is central and peripheral. That's going to be your aerobic threshold and your aerobic power, which we deemed as critical, are accounted for, right? Those have check marks next to them. Good. We took care of those. Aspects that directly target acid buffering capacity, deemed quite important, okay, as we talked about here, is accounted for right in here. We've got the extensive tempo right here, and it fits into the right ratio. Aspects that directly target specific strength, which we also deemed as important, is accounted for. That's right here, the fly 30s, and it fits within the correct ratio. Aspect that directly targets running economy, which we deemed important, is included. It's in here, but it's a little bit off. That's okay. Sometimes you do have to compromise where you know that you can. To me, tempo run, not critically important. This meet, certainly not critically important, or I would not be doing this. That's kind of what you have to do in specific prep. As we said, things get a little bit jumbled. Things get a little bit hard to balance all these things out. To me, I can compromise a mile or so on the lactic threshold because I've been, one, doing it for a long time this season. Two, it's not as important to success in this race. And three, we've got these other things that are much more critically important, all accounted for. So let's go ahead and take a look at the actual calendar and fill in some of the other blanks. All right, so for this, I'm going to use both a screen recording and a head-mounted GoPro, so I hope it actually comes off in the actual presentation. So what we have up here is our fictitious macrocycle, starting here with the first week of specific prep. And then what I have down here in front of me is what I'm kind of choosing to do if I were to fill things in into these blanks here. So we'll talk about what you could do in these areas, thinking about things like the 24-48 hour rule, things like what you have to do and spacing things out, and things like meets sort of getting into account. So this right here is what we just looked at, right? The first cycle of specific prep. We had the extensive tempo. We had the long run, which was at 20% of the weekly miles, 11 miles here. The alactic run, the fly 30s, the intervals, and then that meet that we talked about not being super critical, the off day, and then the special endurance 1. So the second cycle would kind of start right here, and we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the 31st, 8, 9. So right before this median hill. So these last 2 days we would have to account for also. So if we look at this, what kind of things could we do potentially the day after a special endurance day, especially with 2 minutes to 3 minutes afterwards? This is a 48-hour recovery we talked about, right? We talked about this being maybe for a 48-hour, maybe you could get by with something, but we've got right here potentially a VO2 max test, which is obviously very important. We're definitely going to want to make sure that they're okay with this. So we're probably going to have to do something easy in here. So what could you potentially do in here, and what do we not have in this cycle so far that we can see? And we know that these 2 days right here are blanks. We've got special 1 and we've got special 2 accounted for here. So those are things that we definitely know that we don't have to worry about if we were to sort of actually think about it. So we've got our 2 glycolytic days, or acid buffering capacity, right? We've also got in here another one, so we definitely don't have to worry about another acid buffering capacity workout because we've got 3 of them in here. We don't need to worry about VO2 max necessarily because we've got this right here, so we've got that going on also. So what we do not see presented here so far is a tempo run, which would be lactic threshold type workouts for running economy. We do not see, and we're still going to be in a period of not having hills here, but as we just saw, there is going to be hills here, so we don't have to worry about hills, but we do need to worry about fly 30s potentially, because that's not accounted for in here also. We also are going to have to get in our long run, and we're going to get in our recovery run. So we need to try and see, do we get a tempo run in here? Do we get an alactic run in here? And how do we get in those other continuous aerobic runs, long run and recovery run? So what you could potentially put here on the 25th is anything that requires 48-hour recovery, right? Like you could put a tempo run in here, and you would be fine if you wanted to. But I would say that, in here, you probably are going to want to do something easy just because of the fact that you may or may not you may or may not want to really push them to this point to make sure that they've got to make sure that they're ready for this type of work, which you necessarily maybe have or haven't done yet. So what I ended up doing, if you look here at the screen or at the plan, I've got a long run. It's a relatively short long run if you were to actually look at it, because the weekly miles on this is going to be a little bit shorter. If you look right here, it's a week that's going to only have 45 miles because they've got an off day, and there's some other things in here that are a little bit shorter. So I would choose to put a long run in here, even though you've got 2 days, simply because they're starting specific prep, and they're probably going to need something off them here to make it all work out. What could you put here the day before? Something like extensive tempo. Well, you could also move the extensive tempo run here if you absolutely wanted to, and or you could put something else here like a recovery run. You could certainly put the Fly 30 run in there too. So there's a lot of different options here for the 26th. As we were looking at this, if you look at my actual plan here that I wrote out, I was going to move the VO2 max test here, and I had a meet that was sort of changing. So the idea being is some things sort of get penciled in as you hear about this meet, and this meet became important because this would have been on our regional meet course. But the way they push things back in our state, we push things back to where we can't start official practice in Florida until the 24th because of concerns of the coronavirus. This meet is not going to happen. So I'm probably going to move this VO2 max test to right here, back to where it was, and change this to a Fly 30 day, because as we said, we do not have Fly 30s accounted for on this just yet. So what that would mean is we've got long run, Fly 30 run. I love doing the long run the day before Fly 30s. The idea being is you do something totally different back-to-back days. So now we've got the long run, which is critical. We've got the Fly 30 workout in here too, because like I said, we're not going to do that. And now we've got extensive tempo in here. And you see my note here, I've also got potentially tempo run 3 miles, 4 miles, whatever it is, because we talked about that. If you look on here, and if we look at to what I have planned, I do not have a tempo run in this cycle right now. I may potentially change that because we had a short tempo run the week before, but again, the idea being is what's important in these cycles sometimes dictates what you have to do. Now, what you could do, as I said, is you could put a tempo run here and then do the long run here. There's a lot of options you have for as you'd want to do this, but to me, I also know that I'm dealing with a group that missed their track season or the second half of their track season, and I know they're going to need to do a certain amount of Special Endurance 1, Special Endurance 2 workouts that they may have been missing. So I'm trying to get as much of this in as I can. I'm already sort of debating it in my head, and so this is the idea of going through it several different times. Do I do a tempo run? Do I do this extensive tempo run? Because that is 3 anaerobic glycolytic workouts that you're dealing with here as you're doing it. Now, what you definitely could also do is decide, okay, well, let's just see how much mileage that is, and does it actually fit into your weekly mileage ratio? If you're doing 35 seconds, that's typically going to be about, say 250 meters for a lot of them. If they're going 35 seconds, it's at least 200 meters, so maybe we should say 225 meters for most people, times 6. We've got, almost a mile there. It's not going to be quite a mile. If we would say 250, we would say 1,500 meters. It's probably safest to call that a mile just for the sake of making things sort of work out. So if we say 1 plus, if we're doing this right here, 6 of these, 60 seconds, close to 400 meters as they're doing it, add another 1.5 miles, and then add another 1.5 miles right here. If we're looking at it, we've got 4 miles. We've got a week here that is a little bit shorter, so I'm already sort of thinking as I'm looking back at this, and this is what it all sort of comes down to, is going through and seeing what makes most sense for the situation. I'm already sort of second-guessing myself of putting an extensive tempo workout right there. I'm probably going to end up, when it comes down to it, making this a tempo run. So for me, this will probably end up being Special Endurance 1, long run, Fly 30s, tempo run, and then as you can see, I've got a recovery run the day before this VO2 max test. So what do we now have if we put all of this all together? We've got Special 1 accounted for. Even if we take this out, we've got Special 2 accounted for. We've got our long run, which would go right here. Our Fly 30s, which are accounted for. If we turn this into a tempo run, now we've got our tempo run also accounted for. We've got a recovery run here. We've got our VO2 max run. We've got, as I said, Special 2. If we go here to the last 2 days of this cycle, if we look at what I was going to do with it the day after that Special Endurance 2 workout. They definitely are going to need a recovery run. And then as you see here, I've got VO2 max one more time. Now, I'm doing that here simply because of the fact that it's the second day of the cycle. You can certainly do the 2 miles that they got in this VO2 max test, which would be right here, would definitely be short for the cycle, especially in specific prep. You definitely want to make sure that you're getting a decent amount of VO2 max intervals in here. I've got this as a 1200s. It would be times 5 for those top kids, 6,000 meters or 3.75 miles. Add that to the 2 here. If we are going to divide that, and these are in different weeks, so the ratio is sort of for your own thought process on that. But if we divide it by the week that was there of 45 miles, it ends up being a little bit too much. But then if you spread it over 2 weeks, it ends up being, to me, okay, even though if you were to add them all up, these are obviously in different weeks, it kind of works out, and it accounts for the fact that this overall microcycle would have been light on VO2 max, because a VO2 max test is always going to be light. You divide 2 for this week, divided by the 45 miles that we're going to get in, it would only be 4% of the weekly volume, which is definitely a little bit too low. But you add this in with the other one in the same 9-day cycle, and I think it sort of accounts for itself as you're actually doing it. So to me, that sort of ends up being the best way of doing it. Now, we come back, and we've got medium hills here on the 3rd of September. What could you do here the next day? Well, you could do a couple of different things. We've got this meet here that's Sethner Christian. I don't necessarily know if they're going to allow us to do this. There's talk about them allowing this to be a preseason meet, and they're going to allow it to do it. If that's the case, I'm probably going to go through and I'm going to shuffle these things maybe a little bit more. That would probably turn this into a recovery run. Right now, if they don't let us do that, I've got this as a tempo run here and then fly 30s again. We did fly 30s the week before. If we look at where this 9-day cycle would break, it would be the day before this Northport Invitational. So if we were to do it, it would start from here to here. And if we've got medium hills, and then hopefully it's a meet here, but if we had to do fly 30s with a tempo run, we've got a lot of the things accounted for. We've got long hill intervals in here also, and on the 8th we've got what I've got as a long run, Special Endurance 1 times 5 to 6. We've got Special Endurance 1 in here again. I've got flies down here written just sort of as it is. Again, I'm sort of trying to figure out what are they going to allow us to do here. So obviously people are going to have to be very flexible with their seasons and what they want to accomplish. But definitely, if things hold out, this should be the first weekend we definitely can race all out. So these things may be adjusted. I told you about the long hill intervals. You want to make sure they're separated from meets by quite a bit. And then you've got our long run coming in here, Special Endurance. Now what I may end up doing is, if this ends up being a meet that I can do, I may, leave some of these things in place. Sethner Christian is at a meet that has a lot of, or a course that has a lot of hills involved, so that's something that I might want to also worry about if I'm doing long hills there. But these are sort of things that you have to be a little bit fluid with just because of the current situation that we have. Suffice to say, I am more than likely not going to have flies here and flies here, especially at this point of the season. That would just be a little bit too much of the same thing going on here. Now, you might be looking at this and you're saying, wait a second, from the 3rd up here to this last day of the 11th, you don't technically have a VO2 max workout. And you're absolutely right, I don't. That sometimes does happen just with the way these things lie and with meets and things like that. If there is a meet here, Sethner Christian, that's the closest thing to being a VO2 max workout. But again, we're kind of fluid with how this works. And the last day of the last cycle is a VO2 max workout, as well as the fact that that cycle has 2 VO2 max workouts to begin with. So we're kind of over covered there. And if we were to go to the very next day here, Northport, this is getting close to being VO2 max. And I also mentioned the fact that Long Hills is kind of close to being associated with VO2 max. So is there a direct one in here? Not exactly. We definitely overplayed it the week before, and we've got these things that are very close to VO2 max going on here. And then if we go down to the next cycle, so if this ends the ends the third cycle of specific prep, we would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This really starts pre-comp. This is going to end up being an off day definitely for them. if we go and look at the last cycle, we kind of overdid it the first one. We kind of get VO2 max in here, which you definitely always want to be looking for because it's that direct association. We also have this meet, and we've got this VO2 max workout that's going on in here too on the 16th, so we definitely get it covered here in this next window. So some of the other things, as we said, you kind of have to figure out what you can compromise in. You definitely want to make sure you get the long hills in. For us, the long hills become challenging because we have to drive kind of far away from it. We're in Tampa, Florida, and we have to go about maybe 30 minutes to get to that. So I like to do it on off days, like right here, off days from school, Labor Day. And then here we have non-meet weekend. I can do long hills. And then also here in the first week of pre-comp, we're not going to have a meet that weekend either. So I can get a decent amount of hill work in here, these long hills, and not mess anything else up. So if we look at the last cycle, we've got Northport right here. We've got a recovery run. Okay, we've got our special endurance 2 rocking in here. We've got our recovery run. We've got our long run. We've got our tempo run here in this meet. And again, not a super important meet for right now, but that is slated to be our district meet course, so I want our kids to know it. We've got our VO2 max workout, so we've got our critical workout here, our long run as well as our recovery run, so we've covered our critical workouts. We've got in here a hill workout, which helps cover some of the specific strength, as well as a lot of different aspects here. We've got our other sort of VO2 max workout, and we've got special endurance 2 accounted for. We've got special endurance 1 sort of in the second half of this other cycle. If we were to look at what I have planned in here, I've also got a special endurance 1 workout on the 23rd, so we're not getting too far away from it in any of these aspects. So if you were to kind of look at it, sort of the weaknesses maybe of that that third cycle is it doesn't have direct VO2 max stuff, but it does have some sort of indirect VO2 max aerobic power workouts. Maybe the weakness of the last cycle is I don't see fly 30s accounted for anywhere in here, and I also don't see directly special endurance 1 accounted for anywhere in here. But when you look at the fact that we definitely have fly 30s in here, maybe we end up having fly 30s here. It's sort of depending on what happens with this meet. So some of these things are fluid, but again, the things that I really don't want to compromise on are your long run's the most important workout, your VO2 max development with VO2 max aerobic power, and as we said, we're not really compromising it here in the third cycle. We're getting it in sort of different ways in a specific part of the year that it makes sense with the long hill intervals. We've got the 2 meets that are accounted for in there, and we definitely have a really strong VO2 max workout here on the 2nd with these intervals of times 5 to 6 1200s or thousands, and we have another one that'll be playing in either one of these 2 days. As you can see, I'm already kind of taking notes and shifting things around. Again, all these things are a little bit in flux, but because you know the rules of things like recovery timetables, you know what you can go and put back to back. Like for example, we know that alactic, even though some people might think that's a really hard workout, you can do that the day after special endurance 1 because of the recovery timetable. This is a 24-hour recovery. This is a 48-hour recovery, and it's a really hard 48-hour recovery here before this meet. So I put 2 easier type workouts beforehand, so the first meet potentially of the season they can run with their high school team, as well as the first meet they've been able to do since March 7th, which is the last track meet we were able to do at Wharton High School. I want them to have a good showing, so that's part of the other reason why I've got these 2 easier workouts here back to back as you're doing it. So the idea is if you know the recovery timetables, you know what you're trying to work with, you know what your why is and why certain workouts are important in different parts of the phases. No cycle is going to be perfect, and obviously we all have to be very flexible with this time of the year with what's going on in the world and what you're going to be allowed to do in your state. So the idea being is I have this rough draft of a plan. I've got these other ideas if something else kind of plays out. As I showed in the 9-day microcycles, I also go through and I write them all out on a separate sheet of paper. That's what works for me as you're doing it. So as long as you have that plan of attack, you can be more flexible in these very weird times that we're dealing with, and you'll be able to get either you or whoever it is you're training your team exactly what they need at the best part of the year. So let's go ahead and wrap this presentation. All right, so some key points to take away before we finish this up. Pacific Prep typically requires that 9-day microcycle we talked about for cross country, as well as your distance group for track, your 2-miler milers, due to needing to add in those anaerobic glycolytic workouts to start priming that energy supply mechanism. And we still need to work on the same VO2 max, economy, and specific strength aspects that were important in general prep. This does become challenging, especially with those meets, as you kind of saw that were going on. Personally, I do a first look at the calendar and then write out those 9-day cycles, as you talked about. And as you saw, even just sort of looking at it, I'm kind of, as time passes and I get new information on how the season's going to work, how the kids are sort of adapting to things, you know, you can kind of adjust things as you see fit. The second aspect, the separate sheet of paper, is where I tend to make most of my changes, but as you just saw, as I was looking at the calendar, there's other things that also need to be taken into account. And here's the important thing: no cycle will be perfect. Know your why and compromise where you must, right? We talked about, did we really compromise VO2 max on that third cycle? Well, you could say potentially, but we also hit it twice the cycle before. And we've got those 3 things potentially that could target it too, so I don't want to overdo it either. We might end up running 2 meets and having those long hills right there, and then we did it the day before that cycle ended and 2 days into the next cycle. So, you know, I'm comfortable with that. No matter what we end up doing, we're going to get the peripheral VO2 max at that point of the year that is so critically important. We talked about things like the tempo run being a little bit shorter in that first cycle. That's okay. Again, if we were to look at it too with that other meet where we're doing a tempo run, that's okay, because I know that's the least important thing that's needed for the cross-country 5K, so that's where I'm willing to compromise if I need to. This may mean some of your early and unimportant meets become more training days, like tempo runs. Be careful, because sometimes a tempo run can end up being not a tempo run on those days. That's why I do things like the VO2 max aerobic power the day before, so that they have to tempo run. That way it can also be done with doing special endurance 1 or 2 the day before a meet if you want to do a tempo run, as we talked about. I want to make sure that I'm getting what I set out to do and knowing my why. If I want to tempo run a meet, we're going to tempo run the meet. I'm not going to do a recovery run the day before and then tell them the tempo run, right? Like, 'cause they're going to end up turning it into something else. I just like doing with the VO2 max days too, because again, that's so important, so I want to make sure I get those in. If I had to choose between a VO2 max aerobic power day and special 1 or 2, I'm going to probably choose the VO2 max day if I had to only get 1 in a cycle. I know where my importance aspects are. The idea being, again, is knowing your why and compromise where you must, because no cycle will be perfect. I've never gone through a season and said I am 100% happy with all of these, especially the specific prep cycles. They're just really hard because you've got the meets, you've got all the hills, all the different things in there. They're the most challenging things to get everything in, but it's kind of okay too, because you're just starting to prime other things you've been working for a long time. I basically figure if I'm 95% happy with what's on there, that's as good as it's going to get. And again, make the compromise where you absolutely must. You know, and make the important things fit into place before the things that are not as critically important. So if you like this video, please think about liking or subscribing. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments down below. I'm going to start looking at, as well as doing some workout videos. I've got a Fly 30 workout that we did that I'm going to turn into a video here too. And I'm going to start taking a look at the pre-competitive phase. I should be getting some more insight here in the next little bit of how things are going to work in Florida in terms of meets and things like that. But I'm still going to kind of look at this in terms of, you know, what we set up initially, and if things do change a little bit, I'll definitely specify that in these different videos. So until next time, this has been Coachy TV.